Hello everybody. We are at week 6. Hard to believe that. And this is webcast 1, and we are going to be spending the next couple of weeks going into a lot more detail about paths and frames. When we use frames to hold just about everything that we work on in InDesign, it's going to be really important for everybody to feel real comfortable with text frames, with graphics frames, with just objects they've created in frames, and the ability to put those two pieces together. This week you are going to get a lab assignment that is going to take you 2 weeks to do. Not that it's going to take you 2 weeks, but I'm going to give you 2 weeks to complete it. And it's a 2-page advertisement or travel piece about any place you want to go. And there's a sample that the previous instructor did that I really liked, so I wanted to show this to you. It'll be a 2-page piece. This is the first page, and you can see that she did a travel piece on Sonoma County. And I will upload a link for you if anybody wants to use this particular copy and these particular images. But I would love to see you go out and find some place you would like to highlight, any place that you would love to show off to people. Maybe it's your favorite place to go on vacation, or maybe it's just someplace local. But the first page will be basically just about 3 paragraphs describing it, some sort of rasterized image. This is going to have to be the first page will be a rasterized image. So that means it's coming from a camera someplace, and it may or may not have gone through Photoshop in order to crop it or to change the color or the lighting. That's not important, just that it needs to be a rasterized image for the first page. The second page will be a different take on the exact same text. So your titles will be the same, the 3 paragraphs of descriptive information. And these paragraphs here were taken by Cindy Reese, the previous instructor, right off of Sonoma County's tourism page at www.sonomacounty.com. And if you go to any tourism page, there's going to be some descriptive text about that area. So feel free to take some of that and put it on the page. You will also be asked to put in any type of copyright information, like we're seeing here in the bottom left-hand corner. This was a free image taken from dreamstime.com. They have paid-for images and free images, so you'll want to look into that if you're looking for any particular types of images. There are lots of paid sites that offer a limited number of free images that you can use for personal use. You just can't resell them and you can't use them for business purposes. But this is for personal use, so feel free to take advantage of any free images. And of course, if you have your own, so much the better. So the second page, the difference between this and the second page will be that you will need to use a vector image. And this is going to be slightly harder to get a hold of. So if you want to use this image for your second page, that's fine. If you can find another vector image, or if any of you are taking Illustrator right now at the same time you're taking InDesign, or you took Illustrator in a previous quarter, that's a perfect opportunity to take something you've created in that program and use it in this InDesign file. So you can see the information is exactly the same. It's just a different layout. I want to see how creative you guys can get, and I cannot wait to see what you come up with. So the reason I'm showing you this now, even though this is before the assignment has actually even been assigned, I want you to see why it's going to be so important for us to focus on frames these next couple of weeks. We have several frames on this page. You know, we've got a text frame holding designed by, eventually this will be your name. We've got a couple of titles. This didn't have to be 2 separate frames, but in this case, Cindy decided that she wanted them done that way. We've got another frame here. We have the main text frame, and then we have the champagne bottle, which is an additional frame. And then of course she has all of these other frames that she's been working with that are sitting out here on the side. That's true about this first page as well. I want you to pay close attention to this here. I think this is a great way to include some creativity. Cindy was trying to get this nice area here, and let me go back into preview where tourism program is just slipped so beautifully in this area created from the capital S and the descender of that Y. And to get that to work, she took the S, and I'm going to ungroup these just for a moment, and she made a much larger S so that she could move it carefully exactly where she wanted that to go. I'm going to undo that a couple times, and then we see we have the rest of that phrase, the rest of Sonoma, and then the word county. And then she took the tourism program, created another text frame so that she again could slide that right in where she wanted to and adjust a little bit better. Of course, this all could have been done in a single text frame, but it probably would have been a little bit more work to get those pieces to come together. And in a one-page file, there's nothing wrong with creating multiple frames for something that in a book would not work. So this is very typical in an advertising environment where you're creating a one-page flyer, advertisement, whatever the case may be. Now we look down here and we have yet some more frames. And we've got another one down here. So this is why, again, frames are going to be so important for us to work on this week. So let's get to it. Okay, a path is a term that's used in vector drawing programs, and it is a term that is used as part of an item called a Bezier curve. And I want to take you just a moment to Wikipedia. Oh, what happened to my Wikipedia? Oh, hang on, I'll get it back. Oh, I had that all set up. Oh, and of course it's not as good as, let's try it this way. Sorry about that, you guys. All right, I thought this was a great place to get a little explanation here. So Wikipedia tells us that a Bezier curve is a parametric curve frequently used in computer graphics and related fields. And it talks about paths that are referred to in the image manipulation, and we see an example of a curve, and it has handles that would change the shape of that curve. This happens to be a cubic Bezier curve. But as we move down this page, I can get my mouse here, we start seeing a lot of math. And I know that I've mentioned in previous webcasts that Bezier curves, vector images, are really created by mathematical equations. And we get down to this part. I just love this little example they have. It's an interactive view of the curves being made and the angles and all the little pieces of math. The beauty of this is that we don't really have to understand any of this math. We just have to know that it works and that we are given the tools to manipulate these curves inside of InDesign and inside of Illustrator. So both Illustrator and InDesign allow us to create vector images, vector shapes, I should say, paths and frames. And the curves are going to be Bezier curves, and even the angles, I guess to a certain degree you could say that those are, no, I guess you wouldn't. You would just say that they're vector. we have a shape, we have a path, and we have frames. And the paths can be open paths or they can be closed paths. So a line is obviously an open path. And we have a line tool to create those. So if we go over to our line tool and we drag, and I'm going to move slightly out here onto my pasteboard area, and see that as I drag this out, and I've gone over this a little bit in a previous webcast, I can create a line swinging it around 365 degrees, but if I hold down my Shift key, it will restrain that line to 45-degree angles. This is the only way that I can absolutely ensure that I'm getting a straight line. Otherwise, it's really hard to get right to that straight. Can you see how that there's a little kind of jog in that line, but if I hold my Shift key down, it's going to pop right to that. A path does not have a fill, and even if you have a fill listed, you won't see anything. Or if you have a fill indicated, you won't see any type of a fill. But because this is a path, it can have a stroke. So I can make this thicker or thinner, and to resize it, I can go back to my selection tool and extend one of the two anchor points. One of the things you can think of, I often think of the, well, I know Cindy used to talk about Tinker Toys, where you have your segments, which are the sticks, and then you have your anchor points, which are the areas that allow those angles to come together. So if I look at this item and I go back to my direct selection tool, I can see that I have an anchor point here, here, and here, and then I have segments that go between them. So if we go back here for a moment to our line, we can see that all we have here is a segment, but we actually still have two anchor points. We have an anchor point here at the end and another one at the other end. This is our start and stop, giving the indication of where that segment is going to begin and where it's going to end. On an InDesign note, if you wanted to change the angle of this, I would suggest instead going to Direct Selection Tool, which allows you to select individual anchor points. You can't select an individual anchor point with your Selection tool. You have to be in your Direct Selection tool. And I will show you for each one of these the difference that that makes. I'm going to deselect by clicking off of this segment because these anchor points are both selected from the Selection tool. And now when I go back and just click on one, notice that this one is solid, but the one on the left is open. And the one that's open, the one that is not selected, will stay where it is as I drag this one. Again, I'm going to hold down my Shift key so that I can get a 45-degree angle. Wow, and this is popping that funny way here. Let's go here. All right, so that's the line tool. And I think the fact that all of you did that and used the line tool in your very first lab, I think you probably feel pretty comfortable with that. So let's move over here to an open shape. If I select this open shape with my Selection tool, I get a bounding box. And this is even though this is an open path, the path itself does not have closure between these last 2 points, I still get a bounding box when I select it, which is preventing me from selecting any one of these individual anchor points. But if I go back to my Direct Selection tool, now I can deselect that, go back, click on one of those points, and I can change the shape of that open path. I can move this one across here. And this is going to be true even for a curve. The difference is that on a curve, I have these arms that go out, which allow me to change the shape of that curve. This is going to be true about a circle as well. So if I click on any one of these anchor points, both of the directional arms show up. There we've got this one. And by default, the others are deselecting just because it's part of the user interface so that you don't get confused or you don't see too much on the screen that you really don't want. If I click in the center, it selects all of the anchor points, and I can move it almost as if I had selected it with my selection tool. For a square, each of these anchor points is a corner anchor point. So I'm not seeing any direction arms. They're actually sitting right underneath this little anchor point. But since there's no curve, there's no really direction arms to manipulate. Though we'll talk later about how we can convert an angular point here to a curved point. So in a square, a box, I can see that I have a segment, or 4 separate segments, and I also have 4 segments here, but each of these segments is a curve. So 1, 2, 3, 4 anchor points. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 anchor points. You can see that the difference is just that one has a curve segment and one has a perpendicular or horizontal, vertical or horizontal segment. If I click on one of these anchor points with my selection tool, the resize handles are covering up the anchor points. And what's going to happen instead is I'm going to resize this, but I'm resizing the entire object. If you select this with one of these anchor points with the direct selection tool, I can manipulate the shape of the frame. Notice that the other 3 anchor points are staying absolutely where they were when I started this dragging process, and I've changed the shape of that frame. In fact, one of the things that I wanted to just mention too is if you are dealing with frames that have no fill, like I'm looking at right here, and we all know that if I click inside of here, it deselects it because it's hollow. If you click on the center point, this is a great way to move an object that doesn't have a fill. It's much easier to manipulate that than to try to grab it from its outer frame and drag it with that. I just think it's easier to go from the center point. So all of the tools that we have here sitting underneath this rectangle, our ellipse, and our polygon are all vector shapes. And we've talked about these frames over here, and the only difference between a frame and just a shape is that if this frame doesn't have a fill, I'm still going to be able to select it from the inside because of this kind of cross that goes through here. Because this is designed to be a placeholder for images, which I know I've mentioned before. And with the shape, if I click on the inside, I deselect it. There's nothing here. And I know this seems like it goes against what we've learned because sure enough, this has no fill, but I can still select it. So strictly speaking, this is a path, this circle, where this is a frame. And a frame is a container for text or graphics, and when it's empty it's used as a placeholder, but when we put something in it, then it's a frame for an image. This is a rasterized image of some loose leaf tea. And if I move down, this is a frame for text. Now a text frame has a couple of extra boxes in it, and let me change the content for this. Because of this low resolution, I'm my menus are longer than the height of my screen. So let me just change this to text, and then let me put some placeholder text in this one. All right. So we have our standard resize handles, but then we also have this larger box at the beginning and the larger one at the end. I've mentioned in previous podcast or webcasts that this is our import and our outport, which is what allows us to thread frames with one another. But it has nothing to do with the path itself. If I was to click with my direct selection tool on this text box, I would get exactly the same effect. If I click on one of these corners, I've just changed the shape of that text box. All right, we have some tools in InDesign which really help us make some changes that normally you wouldn't expect and we didn't have in previous versions. I think we have only had the convert shape since, I think we had a few of them in 4 and then we got a lot more in 5. But if you select a shape and you go to the object menu, you can convert the shape to additional items. So we've got the rounded rectangle, beveled rectangle, inverse rounded ellipse, and one of the ones that is actually really helpful is the triangle, because as easy as it may seem, it is very difficult to draw a equilateral triangle. So it's wonderful to be able to just go ahead and click on a shape and then change it. Now another tool that lets us do the same thing is the Pathfinder. In addition to all of the Pathfinder commands we have in here, we also have some new ones. We have the convert shapes, and then we also have convert points here. And we can also use this to close paths, to close shapes. But what's really nice is having a visual here and just being able to move through these and make those changes. All right, one other tool gives us shapes, and I know that we're not going to be spending much time with this in this level 1 class. You will go into this in quite a bit more detail in the level 2 class, but I do want to talk about this for a moment. I don't want to ignore it because it's one of my favorite tools, and this is the pen tool. And the pen tool is difficult at first because it's very unintuitive. It doesn't work the way you would expect. For example, sitting to the right of the pen tool is a pencil tool. And if I draw with this, pretty much does exactly what I would expect it to do. It's letting me draw just like a pencil, a real pencil, right? Let me just move this down here a second. Now, I can select these two objects, or actually let me just do a couple of things here. I can select these two anchor points. I'm drawing a marquee just around these two pieces, and I can see that all of these anchor points have been highlighted, but only 2 of them are solid now. Let me zoom into that. So I'm hoping the webcast you can see all of the anchor points that have been drawn, which is why the pencil tool is a very inefficient tool. You're never going to be able to draw quite the way you need to with as much detail because your hand is going to waver too much. And even with a Wacom tablet and a stylist, you're still going to have a pretty tough time drawing this way. But I want to show you a couple of the items we have here. I can close 2 points. You can see that it took and drew a path between these two segments. I can also select both of these items and say I want to close them. And it closed each one separately. But if I select these 2 anchor points again and close that, and then I say I want to close my path, it then took the last 2 pieces and closed that. All right. So let's talk just a moment about this pen tool. The pen tool works more like it's more like putting pins in a bulletin board and then putting a thread between each one. Everywhere you click, you drop an anchor point. And then it connects each anchor point to the next one. There's a game that called Twix. It's a really old game, and this is what it always reminds me of. But if you choose to, instead of click, you drag, it converts that anchor point to a curve. And you start creating Bezier curves in this path. And people who illustrate using Illustrator use this quite a bit to get the shapes that they want. And if any of you are in an Illustrator class or taking the Illustrator class, this is going to be old hat for you, and it's going to make a lot more sense. But just try to play with this tool a little bit, even before next quarter, if any of you are going on. It's just a great tool. And the reason I like this tool so much is that this is what I use to create text on a path, and I want to demonstrate that real quickly. So I have a really simple path here, and I choose my Type on a Path tool. And we'll be going over this in a future webcast, so don't worry if you can't duplicate this right away. I just want to make sure you realize just what a cool thing this pen tool is and how you can use it for other things besides just shapes. I'm going to click to attach that. And I'm going to put in some text. And then just copy and paste some more. And you can see that that path has taken on the shape. And I can go back now, and with my direct selection tool, I can click on one of these handles, these anchor points, and I can change the shape of this just by changing the orientation of those handles. So this is really fun to use for all kinds of things. And like I said, we will deal a lot more with this in a future webcast. But that's what I use my pen tool for most often inside of InDesign. All right. Another tool we have is this polygon tool. And by default, the polygon tool looks like this. And I'll go back and show you how I adjust that. But it just draws something like this, which isn't very exciting. But it can do so much more than that. And how I modify what my polygon will look like is by double-clicking on the polygon tool. So in this case, let's say that I want this to be an 8-sided polygon. I click OK. And if a polygon is selected when I make that change, then that shape will respond, but the next shape I make will definitely be an 8-sided polygon. Still a little on the boring side. I'm going to double-click this tool one more time. And this time I'm going to make it a 5-sided polygon. And I'm going to give a start inset of 20%. And you'll see what that means. And when I draw, I get a star. I'm going to move this one out of the way just a little bit. Again, double click my star tool. But this time I'm going to make that a 10-sided polygon. There are just so many fun things you can do with this. By overlaying polygons on top of each other, cutting them after, there's just tons of things you can do. So that's the polygon tool. And remember too that you can take your direct selection tool and you can delete points and segments and have an open shape. Let's say that instead of filling it, let's say that I do something like this instead. And this is one of the things that if any of you have subscribed to lynda.com, the Illustrator classes, Morty Golding does a really nice class on instead of drawing with the pen tool, he draws shapes. He has this really great class where you make this really cute zebra character. And you do it by overlaying shapes on top of other shapes and then using the Pathfinder to remove parts of the shapes and add parts of the shapes. And for those of us who are not illustrators, it's just a wonderful avenue to follow to get really creative without having the skills of necessarily being a, I'm going to just say an illustrator. But you know, if someone has any type of a background in drawing, they're still going to have to figure out how to use this pen tool in order to think through the shape that they're trying to visualize. All right, moving on. I'm going to move over here to this text frame that I have. And I want to show you another option that we have here. I'm going to select, as you can see, this text frame. And we have a little yellow box in this corner. And this is our corner modification little handles. And if you click on this, all of a sudden it disappears and you see 4 diamonds appear, one at each corner of the rectangle. If I slide these diamonds, it changes the radius of the corner of that text box. And as you can see, they're now curved corners instead of perpendicular corners. If I instead hold my Shift key down, I can modify just one corner at a time, whichever one that I select. And now you can see I have something a little different. I'm going to shade this just so you guys can see the shape a little bit better here. And that's just a much more interesting text box. Now I'm going to back that out. And I want to show you another way that we can create corners here. Let me just put this back the way it was. All right. I can use my selection tool, go to my object menu, and go to this command called Corner Options. Let's see if I can put this someplace that it's not going to get in the way. Right now, it shows that 2 of my corners are rounded and 2 are perpendicular because I didn't get that back the way it was all the way. So I'm going to put this back to corners in both of these, which is none. And let me just put a 0 in here and here. Okay. Again, we have an icon that can link all 4 fields. So if I decide to change one corner, let's say to a rounded corner, and I increase the offset, you can see that I have a 3 pica offset. All 4 corners are rounded, and this is exactly what's happening. Or I could change that to a fancy corner, what they call a fancy corner, which creates a very different effect. I might want to bring this down a little bit. I've got a beveled edge, which is a straight corner, hacking off those corners there. I have an inset, inverse rounded, and then I can go all the way down here to rounded. If I don't want these 4 corners to be linked, just like so many other dialogues in InDesign, I can disconnect this, and now each of these is going to work independently. So let's say I wanted the top left to be fancy, and I increased that by a pica. And I decided that the bottom left was going to be a bevel, and the upper right was going to be a curve. And the bottom, let's say, is an inverse. And if we preview this, we can see that each of those 4 corners is very different. So you can take your pick which message that you want to use. Either one will allow you to modify these corners and just get a little bit more creative. If when you're using the box here, one thing I did not go over is I said that if you held down your Shift key, you could modify each corner independently, but if you hold down your Alt key, it will go back and forth through each of the corner types. But if you don't hold down your Shift key as you're doing that, it's going to change all 4 corners to the same type of corner method. So let's just hold down my Shift and my Alt, and notice now, though this corner is changing, rotating through all of those, it is not impacting the rest of the other corners. Okay, so that is just basically going over methods for modifying our frames. We already know how to fill these items. We've talked about that. Even if we have an open item, we can fill it, and that part that has a curve or an angle will be filled. We just cannot stroke that open area unless we decide to close it. And that's going to be true about an angular open shape as well. You can see that we have a stroke going up and down the other side of this pyramid, but at the bottom we don't see any stroke unless we chose to close this shape. Okay, like I said, I'm going to be having several webcasts on frames, so we are going to go forward after this one to another one. I just didn't want this webcast to be too long. So let's cut this off here, and the next one will be a continuation of paths and frames as we go forward this week, preparing for this lab we're going to do. All right, until then, signing off.